Welcome to today's chapel. My name is Sarah, and I'm one of the counselors in the Wellness Center. And I'm humbled each time that I sit across in this case, video right now, from students and hear their story. It's taught me a lot about just life in general, and it's been a blessing to my own journey. And, I heard one of the chapel themes this year is community. And I believe that has a value in this world that cannot be stressed enough. And today we're going to explore that theme of community by talking about navigating complicated relationships. And last year I talked about the topic of shame and how shame tricks us into believing that we have to hide and isolate ourselves from others because we don't want them to find out who we really are deep down. But the antidote to that crippling shame is community. And it doesn't have to mean a large group of friends or family. You don't have to have a large community, but something as simple as sitting across from another person and letting them see who you are, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And not only does community teach you that you can be real, but you never know how your story can bless somebody else. But getting back to today's discussion, I spent some time thinking about this idea of community and what it means this time of year, as we're coming quick up on Thanksgiving and Christmas is just around the corner. And I don't know about you, but I really love this time of year. I love fall, the cooler weather, the spices and the smells of the holidays, being able to go to the pumpkin farm. But I love the reminder about how important our friends and family are in our lives. They fulfill a lot of roles: a cheerleader, a champion, shoulder to cry on, a teacher. Sometimes they boost our self-confidence, maybe even our guardian angels. And the ability to spend time with them and to be reminded of the significant part that they play in our lives is really a blessing. But for many of us, the holidays are a lot more complicated. We see this rose-colored glasses version of what the holidays mean. We see people smiling and being joyful. We're watching movies and we're seeing ads of families who are spending time together and enjoying each other's company. And we're hearing slogans and other people telling us to be thankful, have gratitude, enjoy time with our loved ones. But instead of these messages bringing hope and making us feel good, they bring out the opposite. Perhaps when you think about your family, or sometimes even your friends, it actually brings up a lot of uncomfortable feelings. Maybe you feel hopeless or sad because you don't have many people, either family or friends in your life, who fill those important roles that I just talked about. Maybe you feel angry because you have family members who just don't seem to understand you, or even worse, they don't care to try. Maybe you feel frustrated and disappointed because you have that one family member who promised to do things differently, but yet they keep doing the same thing over and over and over again. Maybe you feel anxious and fearful because that person that hurt you, you have to see them at Thanksgiving or Christmas, and maybe they continue to hurt you to this day. Maybe you're even feeling shame because you hurt somebody in your family and you're not really sure how to move past that. Maybe you feel abandoned or rejected or resentful because your biological family has not been a part of your life. Or even if they are, you don't feel like they're there in the way that you imagine that a family should be. And because of that, it's caused some struggle for you to connect with others throughout the years. And whatever the reason, the holidays, instead of bringing out the puppies and rainbows feelings that other people have, are something that you dread. And that in and of itself seems fair, that you have to deal with these painful emotions at a time when the world is telling you should be a joyful and loving time of year. So what do you do when you find yourself in that group of people who aren't looking forward to the holidays? How do you approach this time of year in a way that doesn't bring you down even further? How do you keep your sanity? Now, I'd like to propose two things that I think can help. The first is make your emotions and thoughts a priority. And the second is make a plan for managing your relationships. Now, those are just really the umbrella ideas of what I want to talk about, so let's take a little time to unpack those. So the first one, making your emotions and thoughts a priority. First and foremost, I found that one of the things that is extremely important in mental health is acknowledging what you are thinking and feeling. How can you move towards healing if you're unaware or maybe unwilling to explore your emotions and thoughts? And maybe you're not even sure what that looks like. So let me share a story about my life that I hope will help you understand this a little bit better. I grew up in a big family. I have 6 brothers and 1 sister and 2 parents who are still married to this day. And when I was younger, we moved around a lot because of my dad's job, which is not the military, which a lot of people assume. But I was never in the same school for more than 1 or 2 years, let alone the same town. And this made it very difficult for me to form friendships. I had my siblings and my parents, but I often felt lonely, and I had a lot of anxiety when it came to relationships. I was, and I'm still very close with my sister, but I had a complicated relationship with my mom and a disconnected one with my dad. And I don't think that I was super close with any of my brothers growing up, but I wouldn't say, of course, that those were bad relationships. And even though I had my siblings and my parents that I could turn to, I tried my best to hide what I was feeling and thinking, which often resulted from me hiding from people and from deeper connections with others. I didn't go to parties or school events because I was so worried about being rejected or judged. I would skip lunch or eat in a classroom because I was too scared to be around other people. And although I was really good at school, I found myself questioning whether I was even good at that, or let alone anything else. And the more that I began to question my own worth and my own abilities, the more I avoided going after the things that I wanted in life. I turned down a lot of job and volunteer opportunities because, first of all, I was so worried that I would do terribly at the interviews, but I also felt like I couldn't ever do a good job. And I avoided relationships, romantically and platonically, because I was worried that people wouldn't really like me if they saw me and all of my insecurities. Now, don't get me wrong, there were definitely pockets of time over the years that I felt joyful and happy. One of those was when I accepted Jesus as my Savior when I was a teenager. And I did develop close relationships through church and through school. Of course, those didn't last very long when I was moving around very often. And about 17 years ago, I became an aunt to several nephew and nieces over the years. And the unconditional love that they've given me really has been a lifesaver, and it still is. But despite all of the good things that I had going on in my life, a lot of times I was just going through the motions. I was feeling all of these feelings, but I didn't know what to do with them. And imagine the frustration this caused between my friends and my family when they didn't understand what was going on and I didn't understand what was going on. And again, I had people I could rely on, but as I look back over my life, I didn't really have anyone that I was talking to about my feelings and my emotions. I kept telling myself I had a lot to be grateful for. I had a family who loved me, even though those relationships weren't always what I thought that they should be, or even what I wanted. I had a roof over my head. I had food on the table. We celebrated birthdays with gifts. We went on vacation. There was so much that I had in my life compared to other people, and so I thought I didn't have a right to feel lonely or empty, sad, scared, misunderstood, insignificant, and even unwanted. So I tried to repress what I was thinking and feeling, to pretend that those emotions didn't exist. And it got to the point that I couldn't even recognize or give words to what I was feeling in a lot of different situations. And that created more anxiety because I was feeling all of these feelings, but I didn't know what they were. Have you ever just had this feeling in your body where it's just really intense, but you have no idea why you're feeling that way? And you start asking yourself, why am I so nervous? Or why am I even feeling this way? That was pretty much my existence for most of my life. And it wasn't until I started my master's degree here at Judson in the counseling program that I began to learn more about emotions and thoughts and how they play a role in mental health. And I was reading stories and listening to my professors and my classmates, and those emotions that I had buried began to surface. And let me tell you, it was not fun. There were so many times that I thought, what the heck did I get myself into? Why did I think that this was a good idea? But I stuck it out, although I'll be honest and say that it really wasn't dealing with my emotions and thoughts completely at that point. And I still had a lot of anxiety, and there were days that I felt disconnected and even depressed. Now, eventually, I got myself into counseling because I think counseling is a good idea no matter who you are or what you're going through. But it's been through that relationship that I've really started to explore what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling, and learning how my past has played a major role in how I interact with and manage my emotions. And unbeknownst to me, my relationships with my family, I've learned, have had a bigger impact on how I view God and my relationship with Him than I even realized. My counselor has encouraged me numerous times to identify and name what I'm feeling and thinking. Now, some days are still harder than others, and it can be a struggle, but I can guarantee that I'd be in a much worse place if I didn't keep working at it. So why did I share my story with you? Well, first, I wanted you to know that you're not alone in having disconnected and fractured and maybe less than idyllic relationships with your family members. And I wholeheartedly believe and admit that many of you have probably had even worse relationships and had unspeakable things happen to you within your family. So just know that I acknowledge that deep pain that you're carrying. But the second reason I shared my story is because I wanted to give you a small picture of what it looked like to have unresolved emotions and thoughts following you around through the years, sometimes without you even knowing it, and how it affects you if you try to hide those emotions. Of course, that's going to look different in your life. Maybe you use food or drugs or alcohol to soothe your pain. Maybe that looks like you always doing what others want you to do, even if you don't want to because you're afraid of being rejected. Maybe that looks like putting all the effort you have into sports or school or work because you feel like a failure in other parts of your life. Or maybe you've even had plans to hurt or kill yourself because the pain of your past and those broken relationships are so overwhelming that you just don't see any other way out. Whatever that looks like in your life, your emotions and your thoughts are valid. And it doesn't matter what you're thinking or what you're feeling, or even when you've told yourself or someone else has told you that those thoughts are crazy or unnecessary or irrational or pointless. Let me say it again. Your emotions and your thoughts are valid. And if you want to move towards healing, you have to make your emotions and thoughts a priority. Now, again, this is going to look different in your life because only you know what works for you. But let me just share a few suggestions that you can try. The first is to ask questions. Simply ask yourself this question: what am I thinking and feeling right now? Now, you don't have to, and you probably won't have the answer to this question right away, or maybe even all the time, but simply get yourself in the habit and take a second to ask yourself this question. And that will help you begin to make your emotions and thoughts a priority. Now, the second thing would be write them down. Once you begin to identify what you're thinking and feeling, start writing it down. It doesn't have to be elaborate, it doesn't have to be time-consuming. You can write it down in a little notebook, maybe a note app taker on your phone. Maybe you use your artistic abilities, like art or music, to express what you're feeling. I've even seen people who will carry around a list of emotions, and you just circle the ones that you think that you're feeling. Maybe just saying them out loud in the moment that you're feeling them can be helpful. And again, you don't have to take the time to analyze your feelings, but just getting used to validating them by saying them, saying phrases or even one word that describes what you're thinking or feeling in that moment. And then next, get curious. Now that you've begun to notice your emotions and thoughts, and you started writing them down, it's time to get curious. And by that I mean, create some space in your life to think about why you might be feeling or thinking a certain way. Maybe that looks like writing down a question in that notepad that you've been thinking. So maybe you're looking back at these emotion words that you've been writing down, and you notice a theme of you writing down angry a lot. So maybe the question that would go along with this is, why am I feeling angry all the time? Now, or you might wonder, is there a person or a place that seems to be tied to this feeling of anger? And again, you don't have the answer to the questions right away, but simply establishing that habit of curiosity about your feelings and your thoughts can go a long way. And last is to share with someone that you trust. Now, this is the hardest one for a lot of us. For some of you, this could be because you just don't feel like you have anyone in your life that you can share what you're really thinking and what you're feeling. Maybe the people that you normally would share with are the people who are involved in contributing to those emotions and those thoughts. And for some of you, the idea of sharing what you're really thinking and feeling is terrifying. Maybe you're worried people will abandon you or reject you if you tell the truth. Or maybe you feel like you'd be burdening the people around you. Now, each of these reasons is valid and definitely challenging. But as I've learned in my own life, the more you keep trying to stuff down your emotions and your thoughts, the more it's going to hurt you in the long run, and the longer it'll take you to move towards healing. So maybe that looks like finding a mentor, either on or off campus, and just scheduling some time monthly to talk about what you're thinking and what you're feeling. You know, maybe that means opening up to a family member or a friend about the things that you try to keep hidden. Maybe that means finding the courage to finally set that appointment up with a counselor, which doesn't have to be on campus. It can be off campus. But whatever that looks like, I would just encourage you to take the risk and be vulnerable with others. So in summary, these are just a few of the suggestions. So ask questions, write them down, get curious, and share with someone you trust. So let's move on to the second way that you can help to keep yourself mentally healthy as you approach the holidays and those difficult relationships in your life. And that is make a plan for managing your relationships. Now, I just want to add a little side note first, and that is you can't control anyone else's emotions, thoughts, choices, or behaviors. So when I say manage your relationships, I'm not saying you're going to have the ability to manage anybody else. Although it can certainly be frustrating when those other person's behaviors are affecting you. But the reality is that the only thing that you can change is yourself. So just keep that in mind as we continue to talk about this. So as I mentioned earlier, many of us have relationships that are less than ideal with our family members, and that can be due to a lot of reasons. These issues that exist are often ongoing and often overwhelming. And I imagine that many of you may be thinking of a family member or two or more that you have conflict with. And even just thinking about it is creating anxiety and stress, maybe anger, frustration, maybe even fear. And I'd also be willing to bet in the past that you probably tried to push those feelings and those thoughts away so that you could deal with them later. But let me ask you this, have you gone back and dealt with them? And I'd be willing to bet that for many of us, that's not the case. We don't often take the time to set aside the time to think about these things and set goals for how we're going to move forward. You know, maybe you have, and the results have been disappointing. Or maybe you thought about it, but you just actually haven't done anything about it. You know, as I think back about the struggles that I've had in my own family relationships over the years, I can't tell you the number of times that I've been frustrated with a family member, but instead of making plans, I've gone and vented to friends or another family member. And sometimes it wasn't due to me not wanting to have good things happen, but it was because I didn't want to make waves in the family. I didn't want to upset things. Sometimes I just didn't want to deal with it. But often it was due to me being scared of how the other person was going to respond, and the fear that if they didn't like what I was saying, they were going to reject me or cut me off. But the reality is that when I don't make plans for moving forward in those relationships, I'm the one who ends up suffering. So let's talk about some ways that you can make a plan to manage your relationships. You know, and as I mentioned earlier with the making your emotions and thoughts a priority, this is going to look different in each of your lives. There's no right or wrong or cut way of doing things. It's based on your personality, maybe your communication styles, and what works for you. So don't be afraid to try new things. And don't feel like you have to do something if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't work for you. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. It just means maybe it's not a technique that works for you. But here are just some of the suggestions that I have for working on those relationships. And the first one is to make a list. So what are some of the signs that you see that something is an issue? In other words, what are some of the ways that you can tell that you're feeling stressed or angry or overwhelmed? Maybe you begin to snap at the people around you. Maybe you isolate yourself. Maybe you're sleeping a lot or not sleeping at all. Maybe you're using drugs and alcohol to numb the pain. Maybe you're avoiding that family member by ignoring their texts or their emails or their phone calls. Basically, just start to pay attention to those signs, and we're going to come back to that list later. The second one would be define your boundaries. You know, one of the best definitions that I heard or read about boundaries was in an article from the BJ Institute for Learning and Development. And it said, personal boundaries are the physical, emotional, and mental limits that we establish between ourselves and other people. Healthy boundaries allow us to maintain our own identity and respect the identity of others. And what I like about this definition is that it talks about how boundaries are a way for us to maintain our identity and to respect others. So what are your limits? You know, what are those things that you experience in your family that are unacceptable to you and push against your values? And I would encourage you to make a list of those things. So abuse, stealing, maybe constant questioning or criticism of your choices and your beliefs, maybe belittling, teasing, disrespecting, controlling, and the list could go on and on. You know, when family members are hurting us, I think sometimes we think that we just have to put up with it because we aren't sure, first of all, if it's really an issue, or maybe we feel like we just have to because that's just how our family is and that's what we have to do to maintain those relationships. Maybe we're afraid of the consequences, like I talked about earlier. But the reality is that hurtful behaviors are not okay. And you have every right to set boundaries in order to protect yourself. So take some time to make a list of those behaviors. And then the next step would be plan next steps. So this has to do with these lists that we just talked about. So now that you've had time to write down some of those signs and started to set some of those boundaries, you're going to want to plan your next steps. So let's talk about that first list that you made. Once you begin to recognize the ways that the issues that are happening in your family are affecting you, you can now make a plan for how to deal with them. So for example, let's say you're sitting around the Thanksgiving table and your aunt or uncle starts in, as they do every year, criticizing your choices, your behaviors, maybe even your beliefs. You notice that you're starting to feel anxious or angry or tense. And maybe in the past you would just stay quiet. Maybe you'd yell at them. But what if you did something different? Maybe you just get up and you go to the guest room or you go and take a walk. Maybe you talk with your parents or your aunt and uncle, which I know can be scarier, before Thanksgiving happens and tell them that you'd appreciate it if they wouldn't bring up their concerns in front of other people. There's a lot of things that you could try. But the point of this is to realize that once you start to recognize those emotions and those thoughts and how they're impacting you, you have choices. And you have the ability to come up with ways that are going to help you deal with those issues. So let's talk about that second list, about boundaries. So now that you've figured out what your limits are, you can begin to determine how you're going to enforce those limits. And one thing I always say about boundaries is that a lot of times they're easier to set, but much harder to maintain. And what makes it even harder, though, is when you don't have plans to enforce them. So imagine your brother or sister wants you to watch your nephew or niece the day after Thanksgiving so they can go shopping. And you're getting really annoyed because this happens every year to the point where it feels like it's more of an expectation and they don't really even ask anymore. Maybe you don't mind doing it occasionally, but you feel like you're missing out on shopping and spending time with your family and your friends. So what do? Do you just agree and then silently fume about it? Maybe you just tell them you're never going to watch your nephew and niece again. And both of those, of course, are definitely options that you could choose. But again, what if you came about it in a different way? Maybe you sit and talk with your brother and sister and share your concerns. Let them know that you love them and you love spending time with your nephew and niece, but you also want to spend time with other people as well. So maybe you come up with a plan where they stay home one year and you stay home the next year and you alternate. It's okay to compromise even when you start to set those boundaries, but it's also okay and necessary to assert your own needs. Again, you have the ability to determine what your limits are and set those boundaries. And one last thing I want to say about boundaries, it's important to communicate those boundaries. Sometimes we set boundaries, sometimes in our minds, sometimes we write them down, and we begin to enforce them, but we never actually tell the people who those boundaries affect about them. And this can cause a lot of hurt and confusion. Now, I'm not saying you have to explain your reasons. You don't have to defend your reasons for setting those boundaries. Sometimes it can be helpful to explain it if you feel that person would be open to hearing it. But be clear and tell people what your limits are and what you plan to do if those limits are pushed against. And then the last step is know when to step away. Now, this is a difficult thing for a lot of people to imagine because it hurts sometimes. And sometimes the best thing you can do, though, is to step away, especially if that relationship is toxic. And there are a lot of family relationships that are downright toxic. Abuse, bullying, manipulation, gaslighting, shaming, disrespect. These are just a few of the things that happen in families. And although sometimes, again, we think it is what it is and we just have to learn to live with it, the truth is that you have every right to step away when you're being hurt. And that doesn't mean that you have to step away permanently, but maybe you need to step away for a season. Maybe that means you don't go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas this year. Maybe that means you just go for Christmas Eve dinner or for Christmas morning, but you don't stay for the rest. It's okay to set those limits. But for others, you may need to step away permanently. If you have a family member that has abused you and they're refusing to acknowledge it, and maybe they're even continuing to hurt you, you need to ask yourself, is it healthy to stay in this relationship? And again, I know that this can be a hard decision. Maybe you depend on that person for support. Maybe your other family members are not going to respond well if you step away from another family member. Maybe you feel like it's wrong, especially if you believe that your faith talks a lot about forgiveness and you feel like stepping away is not forgiving. And maybe you're scared about how that person's going to react. Again, these are valid reasons, but I would encourage you that if you haven't already, is to find someone to talk about what's going on. Ask them to help you find some solutions to those potential problems that might arise if you do step away. Whew, now that was a lot of information to take in, and for a lot of you, this probably wasn't an easy thing to hear. Maybe you've been subjected to a lot of hurt and a lot of frustration within your families. You might be carrying a lot of pain from those relationships. Some of you have been carrying this for years. And this time of year just seems to bring up a lot of mixed emotions and bad memories. But I hear you, I see you, and I feel your pain. You're not alone in this. And I'm reminded of Psalm 34:18, which in the English Standard Version says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." So just remember that God also sees you and knows you and hears you and feels your brokenness in many ways that other people can't. And I know that I shared a lot of suggestions today that I think can help you move towards healing and wholeness within your family and within your own life. But you also have to be willing to do the work. You have to be willing to take those next steps. And it isn't going to be easy, and it isn't going to be comfortable. But I can guarantee you that the long-term benefits far outweigh the momentary discomfort that you're going to feel. And if you're not ready yet, that's okay too. But just know that there is help when you're ready. Take advantage of the community that you have. Find someone in your life who you can trust and feel safe with, and ask them to journey with you as you start to make these changes in your life. Thank you for listening to today's chapel, and I hope you have a blessed day.